Let's talk about sidechain compression in Ableton Live. What is a sidechain? A sidechain is something external that triggers an effect. In compression, the sidechain function allows an external audio source trigger the compressor instead of the instrument that is being compressed. Sidechain compressors are typically used to duck instruments away from the bass drum and sometimes snare in an instrumental mix. This leaves more room for a specified amount of time where the bass drum and snare may have been lost or appear less powerful in the mix. Let's listen to an indie rock loop without a sidechain. Now let's listen to the same loop using the sidechain to duck out the guitars every time the kick hits. Here's a more dramatic example. Here's an electronic loop without the sidechain first. Now, let's listen to it with the sidechain compressor. The kick is going to trigger the sidechain, which will duck out the bass and the synth. Here's the session for the indie rock loop. As you can see, the kick drum is kind of swallowed up by the bass. The way we can fix that is by using a sidechain compressor. Let's load Ableton's compressor. Let's hit this top left arrow, which opens the sidechain menu. We need to enable sidechain, and then we're going to route it to the kick in the first dropdown. In the second dropdown, we can leave it at post effects. Pre-effects would take the audio before any effect processing has happened. Post effects is after the effects, and post mixer is after the channel fader. What I've done here is I split the kick drum from the rest of the drums for the sake of this exercise. So we have a couple parameters here that we need to be aware of. Like in a standard compressor, the ratio determines the degree of compression. The attack, in this case, we want to set as fast as possible. The reason we want to set the attack so quickly is so that the compressor ducks away other audio signals as soon as the trigger starts. The release will determine how long it takes the compressed audio to come back in after the sidechain trigger has completed. The threshold will help us determine the depth of the compression. A very high threshold will not duck away as much as a low threshold. Let's hit play and mess around with this so we can hear a dramatic example and then a more realistic example. This is a bit dramatic for indie rock. In this case, we probably want a higher threshold because we only want the kick to shine through a little bit and not completely cut out everything else. An easy way to see if your sidechain is doing anything is to A/B with the sidechain on and off. You may notice that you can hear more of the low end of the kick with the sidechain on. This is because it has just a split second of more room every time it plays. Now, let's look at the electronic example. In electronic music and hip-hop, the sidechain compressor is used to dramatically swell in instruments as soon as the kick drum hits. Let's configure a sidechain compressor for this scenario. We're going to load the compressor on the synths group, expand and open the sidechain menu, enable the sidechain, set it to the drums as the trigger, and then the second menu as the kick inside this drum rack. We're going to set the attack all the way down like we did before, and we'll set the ratio to 4:1. Now we're just going to listen and set our threshold. As you can see, every time the kick hits, the synth and the bass are ducked away from the kick, leaving a little bit more room and making it sound like it's a little bit punchier. I chose a really fast release because the length of this kick drum is pretty long. Let's talk about a little bit more efficient way to set up a sidechain compressor in Ableton Live. We're going to use a method called busing. So let's create an audio channel. Let's rename it SC for sidechain. We're going to go to our synth group here, grab the compressor, and simply drag and drop it onto the sidechain channel. Now, as you can see, it is only on this audio channel. The reason for this method is easy routing and a lot lighter processing on your computer. This case only requires one sidechain compressor instead of one per instrument or one per instrument group. The next step we have to perform is setting the synth's output, or where it says audio 2, to SC. Next, in the audio from section of the sidechain channel, we're going to set it to no input. The reason for this is so that it doesn't pick up any external instruments or microphones that you might have plugged in. Now, I'm going to show you what happens when I turn this channel off. You only hear the reverb of the synths because they are not being routed to the sidechain channel, they're being routed directly to the master. As soon as I turn on this channel, you will hear the bass and the pad. A great thing about this method is I can add as many instruments as I want and easily route them to this sidechain without having to duplicate or change any parameters. We can easily tailor this setup to the indie rock track. Instead, let's take this one step further. We're going to set up a trigger click instead of using the kick drum to trigger this sidechain compressor. The reason for this is because a click takes much less time than a kick drum and allows us to really maximize our use of time for the release. What we have to do is first create a new MIDI channel. Shift-Control-T or Shift-Command-T will give you a new MIDI channel. Let's grab any sample. Now we're going to zoom in very close to find a very, very small portion of the waveform. We can right-click to crop it. Now we can see this wave a little bit better. Let's shorten this entire thing so it's only about 1 millisecond long. Now let's crank up the volume, turn the decay as fast as possible, which is 1 millisecond, the release all the way down, and let's enable this channel so we can hear it if I play it on the keyboard. As you can see, this is a very short click. Now, we don't actually want to listen to this, and this is where using post effects but pre-mixer comes in. I'm going to turn the volume all the way down of this channel, and I'm going to rename it SC Trigger. I'm going to duplicate my drum channel, go into the MIDI clip view, and get rid of anything that isn't my kick or my snare. The reason I've decided to use the snare also is because sometimes your snare might be punchy, but it might lose its punch when other instruments are playing. We're going to go back to our sidechain channel, go to our compressor, and reroute the trigger to the SC trigger channel and set it to post effects. Now, let's hit play on the SC trigger clip so we can make sure that it is triggering the sidechain. Now, let's see what happens when I make the release a little bit longer. As you can see, I now have more comfortable control over the sidechain compressor. To summarize, we discussed how to set up a sidechain compressor for live instrument and electronic instrument music, showing two common major uses for the effect. We set up a sidechain bus to keep our session organized and reduce processing power. And finally, we discussed setting up a trigger click to trigger the sidechain instead of the kick drum so we have more control over the release time of the compressor. We kept the MIDI for the snare to duck instruments away from the snare, though this may not always be a necessity.